The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of traffic courtroom 4B, casting long shadows across the worn wooden benches. Sarah Bennett stood in line, her heart beating steadily as she watched the proceedings before her turn. Unlike the nervous energy that filled the others around her, Sarah maintained a calm and dignified presence. She was dressed in a simple but elegant navy blue suit, her natural hair styled neatly, and her leather briefcase containing far more documents than a typical traffic violation case might require. At 42 years old, Sarah had spent countless hours in courtrooms, though usually on the other side of the proceedings. Today, however, she was here for a personal matter. The court clerk called out, "Case number 247, Sarah Bennett." Her voice echoed through the high-ceilinged room. Sarah walked forward, her heels clicking softly against the floor. As she approached the defendant's podium, Judge William Harrison barely looked up from his papers. He was a man in his early 60s, with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses that sat low on his nose. His reputation for running a strict courtroom was well known throughout the county. "Another speeding ticket," Judge Harrison mumbled, flipping through the citation with obvious disinterest. "35 in a 25 zone. How do you plead?" Sarah cleared her throat softly. "Your Honor, if I may explain the circumstances." "The question is simple, Ms. Bennett. How do you plead?" The judge's tone carried a sharp edge that made several spectators in the gallery shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Not guilty, Your Honor," Sarah replied firmly. "The traffic light at the intersection of Maple and 5th was malfunctioning that morning. I have documentation from the city's maintenance department confirming." Judge Harrison raised his hand, cutting her off mid-sentence. "Ms. Bennett, this court sees dozens of traffic violations every day. Everyone has an excuse. The officer's report clearly states you were traveling at 35 miles per hour in a school zone." Sarah opened her briefcase, pulling out a manila folder. "Your Honor, if you'll allow me to present the evidence I've gathered." "That won't be necessary," Judge Harrison interrupted again, his voice carrying a note of finality. He looked at Sarah properly for the first time, his eyes quickly scanning over her appearance before returning to his papers. "The fine will be $500, due within 30 days. A murmur of surprise rippled through the courtroom. Even the court clerk looked up from her computer, her fingers pausing over the keyboard. The standard fine for a first-time speeding offense in a school zone was typically $200. "Your Honor," Sarah began again, her voice steady despite the clear injustice unfolding. "I believe there may be some inconsistency in the application of the standard fine structure. Perhaps we could review the guidelines." "Miss Bennett," Judge Harrison's voice boomed through the courtroom. "This is a traffic court, not a debate club. The fine stands at $500. Pay it within 30 days or face additional penalties. Next case." Sarah didn't move from her spot. Instead, she calmly opened another section of her briefcase. The judge, who had already started reaching for the next case file, paused as he realized she hadn't walked away. "Is there something else, Ms. Bennett?" His tone carried a warning, but Sarah remained unfazed. "Yes, Your Honor, there is." She pulled out a business card and handed it to the bailiff, who brought it to the judge. "I believe it's important to note for the record that I am Sarah Bennett, JG, senior partner at Bennett, Rodriguez and Associates. We specialize in civil rights law and judicial oversight cases." The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted dramatically. Judge Harrison's face remained frozen as he stared at the business card in his hands. The whispers in the gallery grew louder, and even the court clerk stopped pretending to type. Furthermore, Sarah continued, her voice carrying clearly through the now silent courtroom, "I would like to request a formal review of this proceeding, as well as access to your recent case records regarding traffic violations and their corresponding fines. I believe we may find some interesting patterns worth discussing." The morning sun had shifted now, and a beam of light fell directly onto Sarah's face, highlighting the quiet determination in her eyes. Judge Harrison's hand, still holding her business card, trembled slightly as the full impact of his hasty judgment began to sink in. Judge Harrison's courtroom fell into an uncomfortable silence. The business card in his hand might as well have been burning his fingers. He placed it down on his bench slowly, buying time to compose himself. The morning's routine traffic cases had suddenly become anything but routine. "Miss Bennett," he said, trying to maintain his authoritative tone, Your professional status doesn't change the facts of this case. But even as he spoke these words, beads of sweat began forming on his forehead. Sarah opened another folder from her briefcase. Let's discuss those facts, Your Honor. I have here the maintenance records for the traffic light at the intersection of Maple and 5th Street. She held up a document with the city's official letterhead. On the morning of March 15th, between 7:15 a.m. and 9:30 a.m., the light was reported malfunctioning. The judge's face reddened slightly. The officer's report clearly states. The officer's report, Sarah continued calmly, was filed at 8:45 a.m., exactly during the documented malfunction period. She pulled out another paper. I also have statements from 3 other drivers who experienced similar issues at the same intersection that morning. The gallery watched in fascination as the power dynamic in the courtroom shifted. The court clerk had completely abandoned any pretense of typing, her eyes moving back and forth between Sarah and the judge like she was watching a tennis match. Judge Harrison shuffled through his papers, his movements becoming increasingly agitated. Miss Bennett, this court has procedures. You can't simply. Speaking of procedures, Sarah interjected politely but firmly. I've taken the liberty of reviewing your court's records for the past 6 months. She produced another document from her seemingly endless supply of papers. Would you care to explain why traffic fines for minority defendants in your courtroom average 62% higher than those for other defendants in similar cases? A gasp rippled through the courtroom. The bailiff, who had been standing at attention, shifted uncomfortably on his feet. Judge Harrison's face had now turned from red to a concerning shade of purple. This is highly irregular, he sputtered, reaching for his gavel. You are out of order, Miss Bennett. No, Your Honor. Sarah replied, her voice remaining steady and professional. What's irregular is the pattern of discriminatory fines in this courtroom. My $500 fine for a first-time offense appears to follow this troubling trend. She pulled out yet another document. For comparison, here are 20 similar cases from the past month alone. White defendants received an average fine of $175 for the same offense. Judge Harrison's hand trembled as he raised his gavel. This is a traffic court. We don't have time for. Time, Your Honor. Sarah's eyes met his directly. We have all the time we need to address this issue, unless you prefer to discuss it in a different venue, perhaps in front of the Judicial Review Board. The mention of the review board made Judge Harrison freeze, his gavel suspended in midair. Several people in the gallery had their phones out now, quietly recording the scene unfolding before them. I move to dismiss this case, Sarah continued, and I formally request an audit of all traffic violation fines imposed in this courtroom over the past year. She placed a thick folder on the clerk's desk. I've already prepared the necessary paperwork for both requests. The judge stared at the folder as if it were a ticking bomb. The courtroom held its breath, waiting for his response. After what felt like an eternity, he lowered his gavel slowly. Case dismissed, he muttered, his voice barely audible. But Sarah didn't move. And the audit request, Your Honor. Judge Harrison loosened his collar, which suddenly felt too tight. The morning sun that had earlier illuminated Sarah now felt harsh and exposing on his face. He looked around the courtroom, at the dozens of eyes watching him, at the phones recording every moment, at the growing pile of evidence on his bench. The audit request is granted, he finally said, each word seeming to cost him tremendous effort. Court is recessed for 15 minutes. The 15-minute recess stretched into 30 minutes as Judge Harrison remained in his chambers. The news of what had happened spread quickly through the courthouse, and by the time court resumed, the gallery was packed with lawyers, courthouse staff, and curious onlookers. Sarah Bennett sat calmly at the defendant's table, reviewing her notes. Her phone kept buzzing with incoming messages, but she ignored them all. 20 years of fighting discrimination cases had taught her the importance of staying focused in moments like these. A young law intern squeezed through the crowd and approached her. Miss Bennett, she whispered excitedly, I can't believe it's really you. We just studied your Supreme Court case from last year in my civil rights law class. Sarah gave her a warm smile. Which one? Washington v. State Board of Education or Thompson Housing Rights? Both. The intern's eyes widened. Your arguments about systematic discrimination in school funding changed how we look at educational equity. I never thought I'd see you in traffic court. Their conversation was interrupted as Judge Harrison finally returned to the courtroom. His face was pale, and his hands shook slightly as he adjusted his robes. The clerk called the court back to order. "Before we proceed," Judge Harrison began, his voice notably softer than before, "I've been made aware of Ms. Bennett's extensive legal background." He cleared his throat. "For the record, Sarah Bennett is indeed a distinguished civil rights attorney. Her firm has argued 17 cases before the Supreme Court, winning 15 of them." Murmurs filled the courtroom. Sarah remained seated, her expression unchanged. "Her most recent victory," the judge continued, looking increasingly uncomfortable, resulted in the landmark decision requiring all courts to review their fine structures for potential racial bias. He paused, the irony of the situation clearly not lost on him. "Furthermore," he added, "Ms. Bennett serves on the National Committee for Judicial Oversight and has personally trained over 300 judges on recognizing and addressing implicit bias in their courtrooms." His voice grew quieter with each word. Sarah finally stood up. "Your Honor, if I may." At his nod, she addressed the courtroom. "This case was never about a traffic ticket. When I walked into this courtroom today, I was already conducting a study on discriminatory practices in traffic courts across the state." She opened her laptop and turned it toward the gallery. "Over the past 6 months, my firm has collected data from every traffic court in the county. We documented a disturbing pattern of minority defendants receiving substantially higher fines for identical violations." The courthouse staff who had gathered in the doorways leaned forward to listen. Even the bailiff seemed captivated. "What happened here today," Sarah continued, her voice carrying clearly through the silent room, "is unfortunately not unique. But it is particularly noteworthy because it happened in a courtroom where the judge had recently completed mandatory bias training." Judge Harrison's face flushed at this revelation. Sarah turned to face him directly. "Your Honor, the fine you attempted to impose on me today was exactly 2.85 times higher than the average fine you gave to non-minority defendants for the same offense this month. This precise mathematical pattern appears repeatedly in your rulings, suggesting an unconscious but consistent bias." She lifted another document from her briefcase. "I have here a petition, already signed by 50 local attorneys, requesting a complete review of this court's practices. But more importantly, I have a proposal for making this a teaching moment." The tension in the courtroom was thick enough to cut with a knife. Judge Harrison, who had started the morning believing he was dealing with a routine traffic violation, now sat facing one of the country's most prominent civil rights attorneys. An attorney he had just attempted to fine unfairly. "Ms. Bennett," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "I believe we need to have a longer conversation about this in my chambers." He looked around the packed courtroom. "With the relevant oversight committee members present, of course." Sarah nodded, closing her briefcase. "I thought you might say that, Your Honor. I took the liberty of inviting them. They're waiting in the conference room." While the oversight committee members filed into Judge Harrison's conference room, Sarah's mind drifted back to where her journey began, 25 years ago. She had been sitting in a courtroom much like this one, watching her father fight a similar battle. James Bennett had been a respected mechanic in their small town, known for his honest work and fair prices. But one rainy evening in 1999, he was pulled over and accused of stealing his own car. Despite showing proper registration and insurance papers, he spent the night in jail. The judge had refused to listen to his explanation. That night changed everything for 17-year-old Sarah. She watched her father, a proud man who had never broken a law in his life, being treated like a criminal because of the color of his skin. The next morning, she announced at the breakfast table, "I'm going to become a lawyer." Her mother, Ellen Bennett, had looked up from her coffee with tired eyes. "Baby, you know how expensive law school is." But Sarah was already pulling out college brochures she'd been collecting in secret. "I'll get scholarships," she had said firmly. "And I'll work. I'll do whatever it takes." True to her word, Sarah graduated high school as valedictorian. She worked 2 jobs while attending State University on a full academic scholarship. Her professors quickly noticed her sharp mind and unwavering determination. During her undergraduate years, she interned at a civil rights law firm, often staying late into the night, studying case files and learning everything she could. Harvard Law School came next, where Sarah's passion for justice caught the attention of Professor Maria Rodriguez, a pioneer in civil rights law. Under Rodriguez's mentorship, Sarah developed innovative legal strategies for fighting systematic discrimination. Their partnership would later become the foundation of their law firm. The system doesn't change just because it's wrong, Professor Rodriguez had told her. It changes when someone is brave enough and smart enough to force it to change. Sarah took these words to heart. After graduating with honors, she turned down high-paying offers from prestigious firms to start a small civil rights practice. Her first big case came when a group of minority homeowners were being systematically overcharged on their property taxes. Working from a tiny office with second-hand furniture, Sarah spent months gathering data, proving a pattern of discrimination. The case seemed impossible to win, but she refused to give up. After 2 years of legal battles, she won. The victory set a precedent for similar cases across the country. More cases followed. Sarah's reputation grew as she took on school districts, government agencies, and corporations. She won case after case, not through dramatic courtroom speeches, but through meticulous preparation and hard data. Her approach changed how discrimination cases were fought. Instead of just telling stories of injustice, she proved it with numbers. In 2015, she partnered with her old mentor, Professor Rodriguez, to establish Bennett, Rodriguez and Associates. Their firm specialized in using data analytics to expose systematic discrimination. They developed a sophisticated database tracking judicial decisions across the country, looking for patterns of bias. Her father never got to see her biggest victories. James Bennett passed away in 2010, but not before seeing his daughter argue and win her first Supreme Court case. "You did it, baby," he had whispered from his hospital bed. "You're changing things." Now, sitting in Judge Harrison's courthouse, Sarah touched the worn leather briefcase that had once belonged to her father. Inside was the same car registration papers from that rainy night in 1999, a reminder of why she fought so hard. The conference room door opened, pulling Sarah back to the present. A member of the Judicial Review Board gestured for her to enter. Judge Harrison sat at the head of the long table, looking much smaller without his robes and gavel. "Miss Bennett," the head of the Oversight Committee began, "please share with us what you found." Sarah opened her laptop, ready to present her evidence. This wasn't just about a traffic ticket anymore. It was about all the James Bennetts out there, still waiting for justice, and she was ready to fight for them, one courtroom at a time. The conference room was silent except for the gentle hum of Sarah's laptop. The overhead projector displayed a series of colorful graphs and charts on the white wall. 8 pairs of eyes were fixed on the screen, including those of a very uncomfortable Judge Harrison. "Let me start with a simple comparison," Sarah began, clicking to the first slide. "These are all speeding tickets issued in school zones over the past 6 months in this courthouse." The graph showed 2 distinct lines, one red, one blue, with a clear gap between them. "The blue line represents fines given to white defendants," she explained, her voice calm and professional. "The red line shows fines given to minority defendants. As you can see, the difference is consistent and significant." Judge Harrison shifted in his chair. "Traffic fines are based on many factors," he protested weakly. "Speed, time of day, weather conditions." "I've accounted for all those factors," Sarah interrupted gently. She clicked to the next slide. "These are cases with identical conditions, same speed, same time of day, same weather. The only difference is the race of the defendant." The head of the Oversight Committee, Mrs. Thompson, leaned forward. "And you're certain about these numbers?" Sarah nodded. "Every case is documented. But it gets more interesting." She clicked again. "Notice this pattern. The fines for minority defendants are consistently 2.85 times higher than those for white defendants. This exact multiplier appears hundreds of times." The room grew tenser. One of the committee members whispered something to another. Judge Harrison loosened his tie, his face growing pale. "This isn't just random bias," Sarah continued. "This level of mathematical consistency suggests a systematic problem. And it's not just traffic violations." She pulled up another chart. "We see the same pattern in parking tickets, noise violations, and even small claims court judgments." "This is outrageous," Judge Harrison suddenly burst out, his voice shaking. "Are you suggesting I deliberately discriminate against minorities?" Sarah turned to face him directly. "No, Your Honor. I'm showing you that you do discriminate, whether you intend to or not. The numbers don't lie. She walked to the other end of the table, pulling out printed copies of her research. What's particularly concerning is that these patterns continued even after you completed mandatory bias training last year. The committee members flipped through the pages, their expressions growing more serious with each turn. Mrs. Thompson looked up at Judge Harrison. "William, this is very troubling." "I've served on this bench for 22 years," Judge Harrison said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've always prided myself on being fair." "I believe you want to be fair," Sarah replied softly. "But wanting to be fair isn't enough. We need to acknowledge our biases before we can address them." She clicked to her final slide. "I have a proposal. Instead of filing a formal complaint, I suggest we use this as an opportunity for real change." She handed out another set of documents. "This is a comprehensive plan for reviewing and revising the court's fine structure, implementing new oversight measures, and establishing the community feedback system." The room was quiet as everyone read through her proposal. Judge Harrison's hands trembled slightly as he held the papers. "This would mean admitting there's a problem," he said finally. "Yes," Sarah agreed. "It would also mean being part of the solution. You could help other judges recognize and address their own biases. Your courtroom could become a model for change." Mrs. Thompson set down her copy of the proposal. "Ms. Bennett, how long would this process take?" 6 months, Sarah answered. "My firm will provide resources and support throughout the transition. We'll work with court staff, community leaders, and local law enforcement to ensure the changes are effective and sustainable." She turned back to Judge Harrison. "Your Honor, 25 years ago, another judge refused to acknowledge his bias. That decision changed my life. It put me on the path to becoming a lawyer. Today, you have a chance to change lives too, but in a different way. You can help build a fairer system." The judge looked around the room, then back at the damning statistics still projected on the wall. His next words would determine not just his own future, but the future of justice in his courthouse. The story broke faster than anyone expected. By that evening, local news vans lined up outside the courthouse, their satellite dishes reaching into the darkening sky like metal trees. The video taken by spectators in the courtroom had already gone viral on social media. Breaking news. Prominent civil rights lawyer exposes judicial bias in local court. Read the scrolling headline on Channel 7. The evening news showed clips of Sarah leaving the courthouse, surrounded by reporters shoving microphones in her face. "Ms. Bennett, was this a planned investigation?" one reporter shouted. "Did Judge Harrison know who you were?" called another. Sarah handled the media attention with the same calm dignity she'd shown in court. "This isn't about me or Judge Harrison," she told the cameras. "This is about a system that needs fixing. We have the data, we have the evidence, and now we have an opportunity to make real change." Inside her office, Sarah's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Other lawyers from across the country called to share similar stories. Her email inbox filled with messages from people who had faced unfair treatment in traffic courts. The local NAACP chapter requested an emergency meeting. Meanwhile, social media exploded with reactions. #CourtroomBS and #JusticeBennett became trending topics. People shared their own stories of facing discrimination in traffic court, creating a wave of personal testimonies that couldn't be ignored. Local news stations dug deeper into Judge Harrison's history. They found more cases that followed the same pattern Sarah had identified. A reporter discovered that minority defendants in his court paid an average of $50,000 more in fines each month than white defendants for similar violations. "The numbers are shocking," said Dr. Marcus Chen, a statistics professor at the State University, during a news interview. "The consistency of the bias suggests this isn't random. This is a systematic problem that has gone unnoticed for years." The courthouse began receiving calls from national news networks. CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News all wanted to cover the story. Even international media picked up on it, with BBC and Al Jazeera running segments about systematic bias in American courts. Judge Harrison's previous cases came under scrutiny. Other defendants began coming forward, sharing their experiences. Maria Rodriguez, a mother of 3, appeared on the local news describing how she had to work 2 extra jobs to pay a $1,000 fine for a broken taillight, while her white neighbor paid only $150 for the same violation. The pressure mounted on the judicial system. the state Supreme Court issued a statement announcing a review of traffic court procedures across the state. Other courts began voluntarily examining their own fine patterns, worried they might face similar exposure. Sarah's law firm became the center of attention. Young lawyers and law students volunteered to help analyze court records from other jurisdictions. They set up a hotline for people to report similar cases of bias. "This isn't just about traffic tickets anymore," Sarah explained to a reporter from the National Law Journal. "This is about bringing hidden biases into the light. You can't fix what you don't acknowledge." Social justice organizations rallied around the cause. They organized peaceful protests outside courthouses across the state, demanding transparent fine structures and regular bias audits for all judges. The story even reached the halls of Congress. A senior senator announced plans to introduce legislation requiring regular reviews of judicial fine patterns in all federal courts. They named it the Bennett Act in recognition of Sarah's work. Back in her office, Sarah watched the coverage with mixed feelings. She hadn't wanted to become the face of this movement, but she understood the importance of the moment. On her desk sat a framed photo of her father standing next to his mechanic's shop. She picked it up, remembering that night 25 years ago when he was unfairly arrested. "Look what's happening, Dad," she whispered to the photo. "People are finally paying attention." Her assistant knocked on the door. "Miss Bennett, the governor's office is on line 1. They want to discuss forming a statewide task force on judicial reform." And Judge Harrison's office called. "He wants to make a public statement tomorrow morning." Sarah nodded, putting down her father's photo. The media storm was just beginning, but she was ready. This was the kind of attention that could lead to real change. The State Judicial Review Board chose the largest conference room in the downtown office building for their emergency meeting. The room was packed with officials, lawyers, and community leaders. At the center of attention were 3 key figures: Sarah Bennett, Judge William Harrison, and Mrs. Thompson, the head of the Oversight Committee. "The evidence is clear," Mrs. Thompson began, her voice firm as she addressed the gathered crowd. "Our investigation has confirmed Ms. Bennett's findings. The pattern of discriminatory fines isn't limited to Judge Harrison's courtroom. It exists throughout our judicial system." On the large screen behind her, graphs and charts told the story in numbers. The data showed similar patterns of bias in courts across the state. Some judges had even higher disparity rates than Judge Harrison. Judge Harrison sat quietly, his hands folded on the table. He looked older than he had just a week ago, the weight of recent events visible on his face. When it was his turn to speak, he stood slowly. "I've been a judge for 22 years, he began, his voice shaking slightly. "I've always believed I was fair, but numbers don't lie." He paused, looking around the room. "Miss Bennett's investigation opened my eyes to something I didn't want to see: my own bias." Sarah watched from her seat as the judge continued. This wasn't about humiliating him anymore. It was about fixing a broken system. "I propose a complete overhaul of our fine structure," Judge Harrison announced. "Every fine will be based on clear, written guidelines. We'll have monthly reviews to check for bias, and most importantly, I'm volunteering to be the first judge to undergo intensive bias training under Ms. Bennett's supervision." The room buzzed with surprise. This was more than anyone had expected from a judge known for his stubborn pride. Mrs. Thompson stepped forward again. "The review board has prepared a comprehensive action plan." She outlined the changes: mandatory quarterly audits of all traffic courts, public reporting of fine statistics, and a new community oversight committee. "But changes on paper aren't enough," Sarah added, standing to address the room. "We need to rebuild trust between the courts and the community." She unveiled her proposal for a new program called Open Courts Initiative. The program would include regular town hall meetings between judges and community members, a public website showing fine statistics for every court, a citizen review panel for traffic court appeals, free legal assistance for low-income defendants, regular bias training for all court staff. "This won't be easy," Sarah acknowledged. "Change never is, but we have a chance to create a model that other states can follow." The cost of these changes became the next topic. Some officials argued it would be too expensive, but Sarah was prepared. She presented data showing how unfair fines had affected the community's economic health. "These discriminatory fines aren't just morally wrong, they're bad for our economy," she explained. People lose jobs because they can't pay excessive fines. Families fall into debt. Communities lose trust in the law. The real question is, can we afford not to make these changes? The state Supreme Court Chief Justice, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke up. Ms. Bennett is right. The integrity of our justice system is at stake. I am ordering immediate implementation of these reforms in all state courts. Judge Harrison raised his hand to speak again. I'd like to do more than just change my own courtroom, he said. I want to share my story with other judges. Sometimes the hardest bias to recognize is your own. As the meeting concluded, reporters waited outside for statements. But the real work was just beginning. Sarah watched as Judge Harrison approached her. I spent my career believing I was one of the good ones, he said quietly. Thank you for showing me I can be better. Sarah nodded, remembering her father's words about change happening one person at a time. The hard part starts now, Your Honor, she replied. Are you ready? I am, he said firmly. Where do we begin? Sarah picked up her ever-present briefcase. We begin with the truth, she answered. And we don't stop until the system works for everyone. 6 months had passed since that fateful day in traffic court. The old courthouse looked different now, with new digital screens in the lobby showing daily fine statistics and court data. But the biggest changes weren't visible on the walls. They were visible in the people. Judge William Harrison stood before a room full of judges from across the country. His hands no longer shook when he spoke about bias. Instead, he shared his story with confidence, using his own experience to help others recognize their hidden prejudices. 6 months ago, I thought I was one of the fairest judges on the bench, he told his audience. Then a traffic ticket changed everything. He clicked to the next slide, showing his old fine patterns. These numbers told a truth I didn't want to see. But thanks to Ms. Sarah Bennett, I learned that acknowledging our bias is the first step to eliminating it. In the back of the room, Sarah watched quietly. She had just finished reviewing the latest data from Judge Harrison's courtroom. The numbers showed remarkable improvement. The racial disparity in fines had dropped by 92%. Other courts that adopted their reforms showed similar results. The Open Courts Initiative had spread to 12 other states. Sarah's firm now had a special department dedicated to helping courts implement the program. They had trained over 500 judges and court officials in recognizing and addressing bias. Local community leaders noticed the difference. Mrs. Jackson, who ran the neighborhood community center, told a reporter, "People aren't afraid of the courts anymore. They know they'll be treated fairly now, no matter what they look like." The changes went beyond just traffic court. The Bennett Act had passed in Congress, requiring regular bias audits in all federal courts. Law schools across the country added new courses about identifying systematic discrimination through data analysis. Sarah's father's old briefcase sat in a display case at the State Law Museum, along with those original traffic court documents that started it all. The exhibit was called Justice by the Numbers: How Data Changed the Law. On this particular morning, Sarah returned to Traffic Court Room 4B. The room where everything began looked smaller now. New signs on the walls clearly showed the standard fines for each violation, and screens displayed real-time statistics about the day's cases. Judge Harrison was retiring next month, but his legacy would continue. He had trained his replacement himself, a young judge named Michael Chen, who had already shown great commitment to maintaining the new standards of fairness. Ms. Bennett, Judge Chen greeted her as she entered his chambers. I've been reviewing our quarterly numbers. We found a small disparity developing in seatbelt violations. It's only 3%, but even small disparities matter, Sarah finished for him, smiling. This was exactly the kind of proactive monitoring they had hoped to create. Outside the courthouse, a group of law students waited to meet Sarah. They were part of the new Justice Watch program, where students helped monitor court data for signs of bias. Many of them had been inspired to study law after hearing about the traffic court case. The system isn't perfect yet, Sarah told them, but now we have tools to spot problems and fix them. Your generation will make it even better. Later that evening, Sarah visited her father's grave. She placed a copy of the latest court statistics report next to his headstone. We did it, Dad, she said softly. That unfair ticket you got 25 years ago. It led to changes nobody thought were possible. Her phone buzzed. Another court system wanted to implement the Open Courts Initiative. As she walked back to her car, Sarah remembered something Professor Rodriguez had told her in law school. Justice isn't about winning one big case, it's about changing the system one small step at a time. The traffic ticket that brought her to courtroom 4B had seemed small too, but it had started a wave of change that was still growing. In courthouses across the country, judges were learning to check their biases, communities were rebuilding trust in the justice system, and people were getting fair treatment regardless of their race. And it all started because one woman decided to fight an unfair traffic ticket with data, determination, and an old leather briefcase full of hope for change.